Hi, welcome to Cougarcast, a video series about some of the great things that are happening at Collin College. My name's Kirk Dickey. Our guest today is Kate Winkler Dawson, the author of this year's Book in Common selection, Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, the Great London Smog, and the Strangling of a City. Kate is a senior lecturer in broadcast journalism at the University of Texas and an independent film producer who works with news programs including Nightline. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. I'm honored to be part of this program. It's so wonderful.
Well, we're glad to have you here.
Thank
you. So as you know, the Book in Common program encourages our students, staff, and faculty to read a shared book to integrate that information into their classroom and to discuss its themes. If you could, tell me a little bit about your book.
Sure. So the book is what we would call a braided narrative, which are two stories that run parallel and then eventually converge. So in this case, Death in the Air is the backdrop of it is post-war London, so 1952, several years after the end of World War II. And the themes involve pollution and government corruption and wrongful conviction, capital punishment. So all themes that really speak to our society, contemporarily. But for the narrative, to set the scene, it's post-war London. Coal is the major source of heating, pretty much the only source of heating and fuel. And so we have had in London hundreds of years of dirty air, lots of pollution. And so this is the most, at the time, London was the most industrialized and the city with the highest population. And so we had about 8 million people burning really dirty coal, cheap coal, because the British government was selling the expensive coal overseas because it was bankrupt after World War II. So you have obviously polluted skies. The British government had just rid itself of the electric tram system and replaced it with those beautiful red double-decker buses that we all associate with London,
Right.
which are diesel fueled. So you've got millions of cars in the street, thousands of these new buses spitting out exhaust from diesel fuel, dirty coal with sulfur dioxide and sulfur monoxide churning out. And then 20 to 40 power plants that are also fueled by dirty coal. So this is all a recipe for disaster, a perfect storm. And that happens in 1952 when the first week of December was the coldest week they had seen all year. And the government had lifted rations on the cheapest, nastiest, dirtiest coal they had, called nutty slack, and said, it's cold, everybody come out and come buy all this coal. And an anticyclone settled over the city, which happened every year. I mean, that's how the fog is created. And it's a high pressure system that settles over London and creates sort of this vacuum where the air cannot leave. And this lasted 5 days. Normally this was, gone within a day or two. So it put a lid over the city, and for 5 days it trapped an incredible amount of pollution, record-breaking amounts of pollution in the air. And it eventually, over a 4-month period of time, the first 2 weeks it killed about 2,000 to 3,000 people. And then after that, eventually the total number was about 12,000. So this is the world's deadliest air pollution disaster. Always has been, always will be.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine any scenario in modern times that would surpass this. Right. And it was virtually ignored in the news, virtually ignored in Parliament. And at the same time, we have the story of a serial killer who has committed crimes, committed murders before and after the fog.
Right.
And a few months after the fog ends, goes on the run and creates this fervor in the media while
Right.
Parliament is thinking about maybe debating pollution because all these people have died, and the newspapers completely pivot to this serial killer on the one, because that's the sexy story. And I think that, for me, what drew me into this book was the idea that today we are so easily distracted
Right.
in the media, as a member of the media, and as a society, by these sort of salacious stories, the Stormy Daniels stories that we hear about, when we forget about North Korea or the EPA or issues that are systemic and harder to solve. And coal was a systemic problem that was hard to solve, but a sexy serial killer on the run, was a tabloid sensation, and it buried the other story. And so those two stories come together in that way, and they're both actually very important stories.
Right. So, as someone who's lived in London, would you say modern Londoners know much about these environmental disasters in 1952, or is that something, as you say, people moved on very quickly from that, but have people come in to reckon with that since then?
I think that this happened in such a unique time period. So this is, as I said, after World War II. The city is literally shell-shocked. So one of the people who appears in my book is a 13-year-old girl. She and her brothers play hide-and-go-seek in a bombed-out building of a neighbor's home. So, the remnants of war are all around them. They've lived through the Blitz, many of them. And so it is a time period when, they are used to mass casualties. They're used to death. And quite frankly, they're used to fog. I mean, for hundreds of years, ever since London expanded and the trees were cut down, they had to turn to coal because wood was too expensive. And so, the skies of London have been blackened for so long. It was a byproduct of living in this incredibly industrialized, very successful city.
Right.
And so it's sort of a idea of, well, if you don't like it, you can leave.
Right.
And Londoners have endured this and still do. And the pollution in London is outrageous now.
Is it?
Absolutely. Except, of course, it's now, carbon dioxide and
Sure.
things that come from cars. But it was a problem that got very little attention in the press and continues to get very little attention now, quite frankly, except on anniversaries. I think that the British government, of course, is now much more concerned with present pollution. But, I'll give you an example. In the book, we talk about Donora, Pennsylvania, which was an incident that happened in 1948.
Right.
20 people died. It was a similar thing in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. A zinc plant was churning out, horrible amounts of pollution. There's an anticyclone that settles over it. For 3 or 4 days, 20 people died. A lot of people were sickened. There is a museum in Donora, Pennsylvania, dedicated to this event.
Right.
Nothing like that in London. 12,000 people dead, and nothing like that in London. So it's incredible. I think it's a forgotten piece of history. Absolutely.
Well, so would you say there's a larger environmental message in your book, considering that, or is this more just a look at two interesting incidents that happened mid-century last century in 2000?
Well, I think, as I said, the message for the book, there's many of them. Of course, it's a cautionary tale, which we always appreciate from history. History repeating itself. It's a cautionary tale about pollution, especially for me about government apathy. The British government not only tried to forget about the incident and bury it, they also made up a fictitious flu to cover up the excess deaths that occurred.
Right.
So that is a government that's culpable in deaths for multiple reasons. So I think there is, tackling the systemic issue of pollution, which is overwhelming now and was incredibly overwhelming in 1952. I think there is, of course, just sort of the modern, idea of preserving our government. And being mindful of pollution and, the people who we elect to government to take care of the environment. And the overarching theme, certainly, of, as a society, opening our eyes and paying attention to not just the issues that are interesting or, lurid or, constantly make the headlines, but be reminded, we do have an environment. What is happening? Who is paying attention to? Where do we stand with the EPA right now? Right. And it's very difficult to do when you have a serial killer who has buried bodies in his yard and all over his house.
Right. So to talk a little bit more about the serial killer, I understand that I've read that you're fascinated with cases like
Where'd
this.
you read that, Kirk?
I couldn't say. But that you like shows about things like this, and that you like these characters. What intrigues you about these types of characters?
You know, it's interesting. I was at my mom's house. My parents are still in the house where I grew up, and I was looking at the bookshelves that I've seen my entire life. You know, filled with books that my mother has read, and it is like In Cold Blood, and Stephen King, and The Alienist, and a lot of true crime also. And I think that between, you know, my mother being a clinical psychologist and having an interest in that growing up and us talking about it, on top of that, my father was a law professor for 37 years at the University of Texas in Austin. And he was a criminal law professor, so he and I used to talk almost constantly about crime and juvenile justice, and he began the Actual Innocence Clinic at UT Law School, which I'm involved in. And so this has always been sort of in my wheelhouse. And of course, you know, if you're a journalist, crime has to be your beat at some point, for better or for worse.
Of course.
I think that crime, for me, shines a light on issues in society that we might not think about. I mean, certainly there's, you know, the issues of poverty, you know, disenfranchised people, mental illness, you know, I mean, where we are with gun control. So all of this fascinates me, and, you know, it's hard for me to not read about a good serial killer every once in a while, as morbid as that is.
Sure. No, I totally understand that. How would you say that your history in journalism has informed your writing in this book?
I think, you know, I've spent so much time with crime stories, and I spent so much time learning about forensics, and really learning about talking to people in the FBI and local cops about the psychology of criminals. I think that really added to it. Now, I think probably what I bring the most to the table in a book like this is, you know, I don't have a traditional background of a long-form author. This is not, you know, my background necessarily. I have a degree in print journalism, but I never used it until I started writing this book. You know, my background is in television journalism, and I always thought, because my job is to teach students how to write in 6 or 7 word sentences, and that's it.
Sure.
I always thought that would be a detriment in writing a book, and actually it's become, television has become a strength for me, because if it's not visual, I can't write about it. I'm just not interested in it. If I can't describe what this fog smells like, and I have the presence of mind, I think, as an interviewer, to ask people, like the 13-year-old girl who's in this book, the police officer, the young cop who's in this book. I have the presence of mind to say, what did this smell like? When they, you know, one of them responded, well, the fog smelled like rotten eggs in a wooden barrel, which seems pretty distinct and it's pretty specific.
Yeah.
So I think that that's important, and so I think, you know, I think in a very kind of episodic way. I think of visuals, and I think, you know, if I'm reading a book, what's going to paint a picture? And I think that that's my background, certainly in documentary and television.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. The book is Death in the Air. It's a true story of a serial killer, the Great London Smog, and the Strangling of a City. If you would, check it out. It's a great read, and Kate's going to be back March 25th through 27th to Collin College at our Frisco, Plano, and McKinney campuses to talk a little bit more about it. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Yeah.